The letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in August 1882, dusty and crumpled, bearing a name that was almost his but not quite. Fletcher Quinn instead of Fletcher Quincy. Frank Quincy stood at the counter of the general store in Willits, California, turning the envelope over in his calloused hands while the postmaster shrugged apologetically and muttered something about new sorting clerks in Sacramento who could not tell their letters from their boot heels. Frank was 31 years old and had been alone for most of them, working a small ranch 3 miles outside of town with only his horse and a cantankerous mule for company. He had no business reading mail meant for someone else, but curiosity got the better of him as he sat on the bench outside the store, the afternoon sun beating down on his worn hat. The envelope contained a single sheet of paper, written in a feminine hand that curved and looped with obvious care. The letter began with an apology for the forwardness of writing to a stranger, then explained that the author had responded to an advertisement placed in a San Francisco newspaper by a Mr. Fletcher Quinn seeking correspondence with a woman of good character for the purposes of matrimony. The woman's name was Eleanor Brennan, and she wrote that she was 24 years old, of Irish descent, currently employed as a seamstress in a boarding house in Carson City, Nevada. She had no family left since her parents had died of fever 2 years prior, and she was seeking a fresh start with an honest man willing to make a life together. Frank read the letter 3 times, his heart doing something strange in his chest. The words were simple but earnest, full of hope and a quiet kind of desperation that he recognized because he felt it himself every morning when he woke to an empty house, and every evening when he prepared supper for one. Eleanor Brennan wrote about wanting children someday, about her skill with a needle and her decent cooking, though she admitted her bread sometimes came out dense. She wrote about the mountains she could see from her window in Carson City, and how she dreamed of a garden full of vegetables and flowers. The practical thing would have been to track down the real Fletcher Quinn and deliver the letter to its intended recipient. Frank spent the rest of that Tuesday and all of Wednesday trying to do exactly that. He asked around Willits, rode to neighboring ranches, even sent a telegram to Sacramento inquiring about any Fletcher Quinn who might have placed an advertisement. No one had heard of the man. The telegram office in Sacramento responded that they had no record of anyone by that name in their directory. By Thursday morning, Frank made a decision that he knew was foolish and possibly wrong, but felt more right than anything he had done in years. He sat at his kitchen table with pen and ink and wrote a response to Eleanor Brennan, introducing himself truthfully as Frank Quincy, explaining the mix-up with the letter, but also explaining that her words had touched something in him that had been dormant too long. He wrote that he was a rancher with 200 acres of decent grazing land, a modest house that needed a woman's touch, and a heart that was still capable of caring for someone even though it had been closed off for too many years. He asked if she might be willing to correspond with him instead, to see if perhaps the misdelivered letter had been something like fate. He rode into town that afternoon to post the letter before he could talk himself out of it, and then began the agonizing wait for a response. Days stretched into a week, then nearly 2. Frank went about his work with mechanical efficiency, mending fences and tending to his small herd of cattle, but his mind was always elsewhere, imagining what Eleanor Brennan might look like, whether she would think him a fool or a scoundrel for responding to a letter meant for another man. The reply came on a Monday, delivered by the same apologetic postmaster who seemed relieved that the previous mix-up had not caused any trouble. Frank's hands actually trembled as he opened the envelope. Eleanor had written back. Her tone was cautious but not unkind. She wrote that she found the situation unusual but not entirely unwelcome, as she had received no response from the original Fletcher Quinn and had begun to think her letter had been lost, or that the advertisement had been a cruel joke. She appreciated Frank's honesty about the mix-up and found something charming in the notion that her words had reached someone who truly wanted to hear them. She proposed that they continue to correspond for a time to become better acquainted, and if both parties remained amenable after several months, they might discuss the possibility of meeting in person. Thus began an exchange that lasted through the autumn of 1882 and into the winter. Frank discovered that he had more words in him than he had ever imagined, filling page after page with descriptions of his ranch, his daily life, his hopes for expanding his herd and perhaps planting an orchard. Eleanor wrote back with equal enthusiasm, describing the boarding house where she lived, the difficult landlady who watched her boarders like a hawk, the other seamstresses who gossiped incessantly about beaux and marriages. She sent him a handkerchief she had embroidered with his initials, and he sent her a pressed wildflower from the meadow behind his house. By February, Frank knew he was in love with a woman he had never met, which seemed ridiculous and wonderful in equal measure. He wrote to Eleanor proposing that they finally meet, suggesting that if she was willing, she might travel to Willits where they could spend time together properly chaperoned, and if they suited each other as well in person as they did on paper, they could be married by the local minister. Eleanor's response came faster than any previous letter, arriving within a week. She agreed to come, her words full of nervous excitement and the same hope Frank felt building in his own chest. They settled on a date in late March when the weather would be mild enough for travel, and Frank set about preparing his house with an energy that surprised him. He fixed the sagging porch step, patched holes in the roof, bought new curtains from the general store, and even acquired a proper bed frame to replace the rough rope bed he had been using for years. The day Eleanor was due to arrive on the afternoon stage, Frank rode into Willits 3 hours early. He bathed at the barber shop, got his hair cut and his beard trimmed, and put on the new shirt he had purchased for the occasion. He felt like a boy of 16 rather than a man past 30, pacing in front of the stage office until the clerk told him kindly to settle down before he wore a hole in the boards. The stage arrived late, covered in dust from the road, pulled by 6 tired horses. Frank's heart hammered as the driver climbed down and opened the door. An elderly man emerged first, then a woman with 2 small children. Frank's stomach sank, wondering if Eleanor had changed her mind, but then another figure appeared in the doorway. She was smaller than he had imagined, barely reaching his shoulder, with dark hair pinned up under a simple bonnet and eyes the color of a stormy sea. She wore a green traveling dress that had seen better days but was clean and neatly mended. She looked terrified and hopeful and beautiful, and when their eyes met, Frank felt the world tilt slightly on its axis. "Miss Brennan," he managed, his voice rougher than intended. "Mr. Quincy." She replied, and her voice was softer than he had imagined from her confident letters, touched with the lilt of her Irish heritage. "Yes, madam. Welcome to Willits." He helped her down from the stage, and the brief touch of her gloved hand sent warmth racing up his arm. The driver hauled down a worn trunk and a smaller carpet bag, which Frank quickly gathered. Eleanor stood looking around the dusty main street with an expression that was difficult to read. "It is smaller than I expected," she said finally. "Yes, madam. We have about 300 souls here, give or take. It is quiet, but the people are mostly decent." "Decent is good," Eleanor said, meeting his eyes again. "I have had enough of indecent to last a lifetime." The comment hung between them, hinting at stories not yet told, hardships endured. Frank wanted to ask but knew now was not the time. Instead, he offered his arm. "I have arranged for you to stay with Mrs. Catherine Mills, the minister's wife. She is a good woman and her home is comfortable. We thought it proper, you being here unchaperoned otherwise." Eleanor took his arm, her touch light. "That was very thoughtful, thank you." They walked through town together, Frank pointing out the various establishments, the general store, the saloon, the church, the smithy. People stared, as people in small towns always did when confronted with something new, but Eleanor held her head high and smiled politely at those who offered greetings. Mrs. Mills was a plump woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She welcomed Eleanor warmly and shooed Frank away after he delivered the trunk, saying that the poor girl needed rest and refreshment after her long journey, and that he could call again tomorrow after services. That night, Frank lay awake in his too-quiet house, alternating between elation and terror. Eleanor was real, she was here. She was even more appealing in person than he had built up in his imagination. But what if she found him lacking? What if his ranch seemed too rough, his house too humble? What if she took one look at his daily life and fled back to Nevada? The next morning, he put on his Sunday best and rode into town early. The church was a simple white building with a modest steeple, and Frank found himself unable to concentrate on Reverend Mills's sermon about patience and faith, because Eleanor was sitting 3 pews ahead, her dark hair gleaming in the light from the windows. After the service, they were immediately surrounded by curious townspeople, and Frank found himself making introductions until his head spun with names. Eleanor handled it all with grace, answering questions about her journey and her impressions of California with a pleasantness that never quite reached her eyes. Frank could see she was overwhelmed, and he finally extricated them both with the excuse that he had promised to show her the ranch. Mrs. Mills insisted on accompanying them as chaperone, settling into Frank's wagon with a basket of food for a picnic lunch. The ride out to the ranch took about half an hour, and Frank found himself pointing out landmarks and telling stories to fill the silence, the creek where he sometimes fished, the stand of oaks where he had once seen a mountain lion, the boundary markers of his property. When they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Frank held his breath. It was not much to look at a single-story house built of logs and rough boards, a barn that leaned slightly to the left, a chicken coop, and several pastures where his cattle grazed. But he had worked hard to make it a proper home, and he hoped Eleanor could see the potential. She was quiet for a long moment, and Frank's heart sank. Then she turned to him with the first genuine smile he had seen from her. "It looks like a place where a person could build a life," she said simply. They spent the afternoon exploring the property, Mrs. Mills trailing behind at a discreet distance. Eleanor asked intelligent questions about the cattle, the water supply, the growing season for crops. She examined the garden plot with interest and walked through the house with a critical but not unkind eye, running her fingers over the new curtains and nodding approvingly at the iron stove. "You have made a good start here," she told him as they stood on the porch watching the sun begin its descent toward the hills. "I can see you are a man who works hard." "I do my best," Frank replied. "It has been lonely work, though. A place like this needs more than one person to make it truly thrive." Eleanor met his gaze directly. "Mr. Quincy, I think we should speak plainly with each other. We have corresponded for months, and I feel I know your character through your letters. You seem to know mine as well. But letters can only tell so much. I need to know what you truly expect from a wife, and you deserve to know what I can and cannot offer." Mrs. Mills had wandered over to examine the chicken coop, giving them a measure of privacy. Frank considered his words carefully. "I expect honesty, partnership, and kindness," he said. "I hope for affection, though I know such things cannot be forced and must grow naturally. I want children someday if God wills it, and I want a home full of warmth instead of this emptiness I have been living with. What I do not expect is perfection, because I am far from perfect myself. As for what I offer in return, I can promise to provide for you to the best of my ability, to treat you with respect, to remain faithful, and to do everything in my power to make you happy." Eleanor's eyes had grown bright with unshed tears. "That is more than I dared hope for," she said quietly. "I can offer you a strong back for work, skill with a needle and cooking, though as I mentioned my bread needs improvement. I can offer you loyalty and honesty. I cannot promise to love you immediately, Mr. Quincy, because love is not something I can summon on command. But I can promise to try, to open my heart to the possibility, if you are patient with me." "I have been patient for 31 years, Frank said, surprised by the emotion thickening his voice. "I can wait as long as you need." They agreed that evening to marry the following Saturday, giving them a week to make preparations and file the necessary papers. Frank knew it was fast, perhaps too fast by some people's standards, but they had been corresponding for months, and both of them were of an age where lengthy courtship seemed unnecessary. Eleanor returned to stay with Mrs. Mills, and Frank threw himself into final preparations on the ranch. The week passed in a blur of activity. Frank rode into town each day to see Eleanor, sometimes walking with her through Willets, other times sitting in Mrs. Mills's parlor talking about their plans for the future. Eleanor proved to have a sharp mind for business, suggesting improvements to the ranch that Frank had not considered. She also had a dry sense of humor that caught him off guard and made him laugh more than he had in years. He learned more of her history in bits and pieces. Her parents had immigrated from Ireland when she was 12, settling in New York before eventually making their way west. Her father had worked on the railroads until a fever swept through their camp, taking both parents within days of each other. Eleanor had been forced to make her own way since age 22, working as a seamstress and occasionally as a housekeeper. She mentioned in passing that she had once been engaged to a man in Nevada who turned out to be a drunk and a liar, and that experience had left her cautious, but not completely closed to the idea of marriage with the right person. Frank shared his own story growing up on a farm in Missouri, losing his mother when he was young, working for his father until the old man died 5 years ago and left him a small inheritance. He had used that money to come west and buy this land, hoping to build something lasting. He had courted a woman once, back in Missouri, but she had chosen someone else, someone with better prospects and a more charming manner. That rejection had stung enough to make him wary of opening his heart again, but loneliness was a harder taskmaster than pride. Saturday arrived with clear skies and a warm breeze that smelled of wildflowers and grass. The wedding took place in the church with most of the town in attendance, as any excuse for a celebration was eagerly seized upon in a small community. Eleanor wore a simple dress of cream-colored cotton that she had sewn herself during the week, with lace at the collar and cuffs. She carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Mrs. Mills had helped her gather that morning. Frank stood at the altar in his best suit, his hair slicked back and his heart pounding so hard he thought surely everyone could hear it. When Eleanor walked down the aisle on the arm of Reverend Mills, her eyes found his and held, and he saw the same nervousness and hope reflected there that he felt. The ceremony was brief and traditional. They exchanged vows that felt heavy with promise, and when Reverend Mills pronounced them man and wife, Frank kissed Eleanor gently, quickly, aware of the watching crowd. Her lips were soft and warm, and the brief contact sent a shock through his system. The townspeople had organized a reception in the church hall with food and music provided by various families. Frank and Eleanor found themselves the center of attention, accepting congratulations and well wishes from people they barely knew. Eleanor smiled until her face must have ached, and Frank shook so many hands his arm grew tired. Finally, as the sun began to set, they were able to slip away. Frank had borrowed a buggy for the occasion, wanting Eleanor's first ride home as his wife to be more comfortable than the rough wagon. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the sounds of celebration fading behind them. "Are you frightened?" Frank asked as they turned onto the path leading to the ranch. "Terrified," Eleanor admitted. "Are you?" "Yes." They looked at each other and laughed, the tension breaking slightly. When they arrived at the house, Frank climbed down and then lifted Eleanor from the buggy, his hands spanning her waist. On impulse, instead of setting her down, he carried her up the porch steps and across the threshold, Eleanor gasping in surprise and clutching his shoulders. Inside, he set her down carefully. The house was dim, and he hurried to light lamps, suddenly seeing the space through her eyes and finding it wanting. But Eleanor removed her bonnet and gloves and looked around with an expression of quiet satisfaction. "It feels different now," she said. "More like home. I hope it will become that for you, truly." They stood awkwardly for a moment, the weight of expectations and the intimacy to come hanging between them. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice quiet. "Frank, I know what is expected on a wedding night. But I wonder if we might take things slowly. I am not afraid of you, but I am not quite ready for everything all at once. Is that terribly improper to ask?" Relief flooded through Frank so intensely he almost laughed. "I was hoping you might say something like that." "Eleanor, we have the rest of our lives ahead of us. We do not need to rush everything in one night. Let us just be comfortable with each other first." The gratitude in her eyes was reward enough. They spent the evening talking by lamplight, Eleanor examining the books on Frank's small shelf with interest, and Frank brewing tea. When tiredness finally overtook them, they retired to the bedroom together, but simply lay beside each other in the darkness, holding hands, the intimacy of shared space and quiet breathing somehow more profound than anything physical. In the days and weeks that followed, they built a life together piece by piece. Eleanor transformed the house with small touches, curtains she sewed for every window, a tablecloth with embroidered edges, wildflowers in jars on the table and windowsills. She took over the cooking, and Frank discovered that while her bread was indeed dense at first, she quickly mastered the technique. Her stews were excellent, her pies remarkable. Frank taught Eleanor to ride his gentler mare, and she proved a quick learner despite her initial nervousness. She insisted on helping with ranch work beyond the house, feeding chickens and gathering eggs, helping him plant a proper vegetable garden, even learning to milk the cow he purchased in April. She approached everything with determination and a practical mindset that Frank found himself admiring more each day. They learned each other's rhythms and habits, the small things that make up a shared life. Eleanor liked to rise early and watch the sunrise with her tea. Frank tended to hum tunelessly while he worked, which she found endearing. She was methodical and organized. He was more spontaneous and sometimes scattered. They balanced each other in ways neither had anticipated. The physical side of their marriage developed slowly, naturally, beginning with small touches, a hand on a shoulder, fingers brushing as they passed tools or dishes, Frank kissing Eleanor's forehead before sleep. The first time they truly came together as husband and wife was nearly a month after the wedding, on a warm night in late April. It was gentle and tentative, both of them nervous, but there was care and consideration in every touch. Afterward, Eleanor cried, and when Frank asked in alarm if he had hurt her, she shook her head and explained that she was simply overwhelmed by feeling safe and wanted, something she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. Summer arrived, bringing long days of work in the fields and pastures. Frank's cattle thrived, and he was able to sell several head at good prices. Eleanor sold her sewing services to women in town, creating a small income of her own that she seemed proud to contribute. They saved money carefully, discussing plans to expand the herd, perhaps buy the adjacent property if it ever came available. In August, a year after the misdelivered letter had arrived, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant. She told Frank one evening over supper, her voice trembling with nervous excitement. Frank's reaction was immediate and visceral. He stood so quickly his chair fell over, rounded the table, and pulled Eleanor into his arms, burying his face in her hair as emotion overwhelmed him. "We are going to have a family," he whispered against her temple. "A real family. Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, even though his reaction made the answer obvious. "I have never been happier in my entire life, not even close." The pregnancy progressed through fall and into winter. Eleanor continued her work as long as she could, though Frank became increasingly protective and tried to prevent her from doing anything too strenuous. She tolerated his hovering with good humor, occasionally reminding him that women had been having babies since the beginning of time, and she was hardly the first to do so while managing a household. They used the long winter evenings to prepare for the baby's arrival, Frank building a cradle from oak wood and Eleanor sewing tiny gowns and blankets. They argued playfully about names, Frank favoring traditional family names while Eleanor preferred something more unusual. They settled eventually on a list of possibilities, deciding to wait until they met the baby to choose. In February 1884, on a cold night with wind howling around the house, Eleanor went into labor. Frank rode for Mrs. Mills, who served as midwife for most births in the area, then spent the longest night of his life pacing and praying while Eleanor labored in their bedroom. Mrs. Mills emerged periodically to request hot water or clean cloths, always shooing him away when he tried to enter. Finally, as dawn broke over the hills, a baby's cry pierced the air. Frank froze in the kitchen, his heart seeming to stop and race simultaneously. Moments later, Mrs. Mills appeared in the doorway, her face tired but wreathed in smiles. "You have a son, Mr. Quincy, a strong, healthy boy. And your wife is doing well, though she is exhausted." Frank pushed past her, propriety forgotten, and entered the bedroom. Eleanor lay propped against pillows, her hair damp with sweat and her face pale with exhaustion, but her eyes were bright with joy. In her arms was a small bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she had sewn. "Frank," she said softly, "come meet your son." He approached on shaking legs and looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that were trying to focus. One small hand had escaped the blanket, fingers curling and uncurling. "He is beautiful," Frank managed, his voice breaking. "You are beautiful. Eleanor, I do not have words for what I am feeling right now." "Then do not try," she said, smiling up at him. "Just feel it." Frank sat carefully on the edge of the bed and gently touched his son's cheek with one finger. The baby turned toward the touch instinctively, and Frank felt something crack open in his chest, a capacity for love he had not known he possessed. They named him James, after Frank's father, with Eleanor's father's name as the middle name Declan. James Declan Quincy. The baby was baptized 3 weeks later in the same church where his parents had married, with half the town in attendance once again. The first years of James's life passed in a blur of sleepless nights and endless wonder. Frank discovered that fatherhood suited him in ways he had not anticipated, finding joy in the smallest milestones: the first smile, the first tooth, the first tentative steps. Eleanor bloomed as a mother, patient and loving even in the most trying moments. The ranch prospered as well. Frank was able to hire occasional help during busy seasons, and he purchased more cattle, gradually building his herd. Eleanor's sewing business grew by word of mouth until she had more commissions than she could easily handle, even with limiting herself to evenings after James was asleep. In the spring of 1886, Eleanor gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Rose Catherine. The birth was easier than the first, and Eleanor recovered quickly. Rose was a placid baby compared to her energetic brother, content to watch the world with solemn eyes. James, now 2 years old, was fascinated by his little sister and wanted to help with everything. Though his help often created more work than it saved, life settled into a rhythm that felt both ordinary and miraculous. Frank would sometimes pause in his work and look at the house smoke curling from the chimney, Eleanor visible through a window with a child on her hip, James playing in the yard, and feel overwhelmed by gratitude for a misdelivered letter and his own foolish courage in responding to it. One evening in the summer of 1887, when James was 3 and Rose was learning to walk, Frank and Eleanor sat on their porch after the children were asleep, watching the stars emerge. It was their habit when weather permitted, this quiet time together after the chaos of the day. "Do you ever think about how different your life might have been if that letter had gone to the right person?" Eleanor asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "Every day," Frank admitted, "and I am grateful every day that it did not." "Do you think there really was a Fletcher Quinn? Or do you think perhaps there was never an advertisement at all, just fate conspiring to bring us together?" Frank considered this. "I spent a lot of time trying to find him that first week. Part of me wanted to believe he did not exist, that the letter was meant for me all along. But I honestly do not know. Does it matter?" "No," Eleanor said softly. "I suppose it does not. Although I confess I used to wonder if he ever received my letter, if he was angry or confused by it. Or perhaps he received a letter meant for someone else and is having this same conversation with his own wife right now, wondering about us." Eleanor laughed, the sound warm in the darkness. "That would be a nice symmetry, would it not?" They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds: crickets, the distant call of an owl, cattle lowing softly in the pasture. Finally, Eleanor spoke again. "Frank, I want you to know something. I have never told you this directly, and I think it is time I did. I love you. Deeply and completely. I do not just care for you or feel fondness for you. I am in love with you, with the life we have built, with the man you are. I know I said in the beginning that I could not promise love, that it would have to grow naturally, but it has grown and it is real and strong, and I needed you to know." Frank felt his throat tighten with emotion. He turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "I have loved you since before I ever met you, from those first letters, and that love has only grown deeper and more certain with every passing day. You are my partner, my best friend, the mother of my children, the reason I wake up grateful every morning. I thank God for that misfiled letter every single day, because it brought you to me." Eleanor leaned forward and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. "Then we are both blessed beyond measure." The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and challenges, as all lives do. There was the winter of 1888 when a terrible storm killed several head of cattle and damaged the barn, requiring significant repairs. There was the summer drought of 1889 that tested their resources and their spirits. There was the frightening week when James, at age 5, fell ill with a fever that had them both terrified until it finally broke. But there were far more good times than bad. James grew into an energetic, curious boy who loved the ranch and followed his father everywhere. Rose developed a quiet strength and a gift for growing things, her small garden plot producing vegetables that rivaled Eleanor's. In 1890, Eleanor gave birth to their third child, another son they named Thomas after Eleanor's uncle. Thomas proved to be a happy baby who smiled at everything and everyone. The ranch expanded steadily. Frank purchased the adjacent property when it became available in 1891, doubling their land. He hired 2 full-time ranch hands, young men from town who lived in a bunkhouse Frank built near the barn. Eleanor's sewing business eventually became too much to manage alongside her household duties, so she taught her skills to several young women in town, creating a small cooperative where they shared commissions and supported each other. By 1893, Frank and Eleanor had been married for over a decade. Frank was 42 now, with silver threading through his hair at the temples. Eleanor was 35, still beautiful, though carrying the marks of years of hard work and childbearing. They had 3 children, James at 9, Rose at 7, and Thomas at 3, and a ranch that was one of the most successful in the area. One day in October of that year, Frank rode into town for supplies and stopped by the post office. The postmaster, the same one who had given him that misdelivered letter so many years ago, handed him his mail with a knowing smile. "Still grateful for my mistake all those years back, Frank?" the older man asked. "Every single day, Henry, every single day." There was a letter in the stack, addressed to Frank in an unfamiliar hand. He opened it curiously, standing there at the counter. It was from a lawyer in San Francisco, informing him that a distant relative he had never met had died and left him a modest inheritance, $3,000. Frank stared at the letter in shock. $3,000 was more money than he had ever had at once in his life. He rode home in a daze, his mind spinning with possibilities. When he showed Eleanor the letter, she read it twice, then looked at him with wide eyes. "Frank, this is a fortune. What should we do with it?" They discussed it for days, considering various options. They could expand the ranch further, buy more cattle, build a larger house. But as they talked, another idea began to take shape. James would be college age in less than a decade. Rose and Thomas would follow. Education had never been an option for either Frank or Eleanor. They had both learned what they could from their parents and experience, but with this money, they could ensure their children had opportunities they never had. They decided to save the money carefully, investing it wisely, creating a fund for their children's education. Not all of it. Certainly they would use a portion to make some improvements to the ranch and house, but the bulk would be set aside for the future. The improvements they did make were significant. They built a larger house with separate bedrooms for the children, a proper dining room, and a spacious kitchen that Eleanor had always dreamed of. They renovated the barn and added another wing for hay storage. Frank purchased breeding stock to improve his herd quality. Through it all, their family remained the center of everything. Frank made a point of spending time with each child individually, teaching James about ranching, helping Rose with her garden, playing with young Thomas. Eleanor created traditions, Sunday dinners with the whole family, reading together in the evenings, celebrating birthdays with special cakes and small gifts. The children grew and thrived. James developed a natural talent for working with animals and a head for business that impressed Frank. Rose showed artistic ability, creating beautiful drawings and helping her mother with increasingly complex sewing projects. Thomas proved to be mechanically inclined, always taking things apart to see how they worked. In 1896, Eleanor found herself pregnant again at age 38. It was unexpected. They had assumed their family was complete, but the news was met with joy rather than dismay. Eleanor's pregnancy was more difficult than the previous ones, and Frank worried constantly. But in February 1897, she gave birth to a healthy daughter they named Margaret Ann. Margaret, called Maggie from the start, was a delightful surprise in their lives, doted on by her older siblings and parents alike. She was a cheerful baby who seemed to find joy in everything, her laughter filling the house. The turn of the century found the Quincy family prosperous and happy. Frank was 49, his hair now more silver than brown, his face weathered by years of outdoor work but his eyes still bright. Eleanor was 42, her dark hair showing threads of gray, her figure fuller after 4 children but her beauty undiminished in Frank's eyes. James was 15 and already helping run the ranch like an adult. Rose was 13 and talking about becoming a teacher. Thomas was 9 and still taking everything apart. Maggie was 3 and into everything. One evening in the spring of 1900, after the children were all in bed, Frank and Eleanor took their customary walk around the property. It was something they tried to do regularly, even after all these years, needing the time alone together to stay connected amidst the demands of family and ranch. They walked hand in hand to the top of the hill overlooking the ranch, where they could see everything they had built spread out below them, the house with warm light glowing from the windows, the barn and outbuildings, the pastures where cattle grazed, the garden plots, the orchard Frank had planted 5 years ago now bearing fruit. "Do you remember the first time you brought me here?" Eleanor asked. "I was so nervous. I had traveled all this way to meet a man I had never seen, based on letters that were never meant for me in the first place. I was convinced I was making a terrible mistake. Were you?" Frank asked, though he knew the answer. "It was the best decision I ever made," Eleanor said, squeezing his hand. "Every bit of it, the fear, the uncertainty, the risk, it was all worth it for this life we have made." Frank pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. "I was terrified when you stepped off that stage. I was certain you would take one look at me and realize you had made a horrible error. I was certain I was not good enough for you, that my ranch was too small, my prospects too limited." "You were everything I needed," Eleanor said, her voice muffled against his chest. "You still are. Frank, we have built something remarkable here, not just the ranch, though that is impressive, but this family, this love, this life. It is more than I ever dreamed possible." They stood there as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink and purple, holding each other and counting their blessings. After 18 years of marriage, they were more in love than ever, their bond deepened by shared experiences, by challenges overcome together, by the family they had created. The years that followed brought the natural changes that time brings to all families. James finished his schooling in Willits, and, using the education fund his parents had created, attended college in Sacramento, studying agriculture and business. He returned to the ranch at age 22, bringing with him new ideas and modern techniques. 2 years later, he married a local girl named Sarah Miller, a schoolteacher who shared his love of the land. They built a house on the eastern section of the ranch property, and James became Frank's full partner in running the operation. Rose also attended college, fulfilling her dream of becoming a teacher. She taught in Willits for several years before meeting and marrying a lawyer from San Francisco who had moved to town. They remained in the area, giving Eleanor and Frank the joy of having their daughter nearby. Thomas showed no interest in college, preferring instead to learn a trade. He apprenticed with the blacksmith in town and proved to have a gift for metalwork. Eventually, He took over the smithy when the old blacksmith retired, becoming an essential part of the community. Maggie, the baby of the family, grew into a spirited young woman with her mother's beauty and her father's determination. She showed musical talent early on, and Frank and Eleanor arranged for piano lessons and later sent her to a music conservatory in San Francisco. As the children established their own lives, Frank and Eleanor found themselves entering a new phase. The ranch was largely in James's capable hands now, though Frank still worked every day, unable to imagine complete retirement. Eleanor finally gave up sewing for others entirely, focusing instead on her family and a flower garden that had become the envy of the county. Grandchildren began arriving in the early 1920s. James and Sarah had 4 children in quick succession, filling the ranch with young energy once again. Rose had 2 daughters. Eventually, Thomas married a widow from town who had a child from her first marriage, and they added 2 more children to their family. Even Maggie, who everyone assumed would remain in San Francisco pursuing her music, surprised them all by returning to Willits at age 26 with a husband in tow, a fellow musician who was happy to make a quieter life in the country. Frank and Eleanor embraced their roles as grandparents with enthusiasm, finding joy in watching their children raise families of their own. They watched their grandchildren grow and play on the same land where their own children had been raised, creating a legacy that stretched beyond anything they had imagined that day, when a misdelivered letter changed both their lives. By 1930, Frank was 79 years old, moving more slowly but still sharp of mind and spirit. Eleanor was 72, her hair now completely white but her eyes still bright with intelligence and humor. They had been married for 48 years, and their love had only deepened with time, weathering all the storms that life brought and emerging stronger for it. They still took walks together when weather and health permitted, still held hands, still found reasons to laugh together. Their children visited regularly, bringing grandchildren and, increasingly, great-grandchildren. The ranch had grown to over 1,000 acres, one of the largest in the region, managed now primarily by James and his oldest son, but still bearing Frank's stamp on every corner. One warm evening in June 1930, Frank and Eleanor sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the hills they knew so well. The porch had been rebuilt several times over the years, but they always ensured there were 2 chairs placed just so, perfect for watching the evening come on. "Do you know what today is?" Frank asked. "Wednesday," Eleanor replied with a smile. "It is 48 years to the day since I stood outside the general store and read a letter that was not meant for me." Eleanor reached over and took his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. "The letter that changed everything. The letter that brought me you," Frank said. "Eleanor, I have lived a long life now, and I can say without hesitation that every good thing in it stems from that moment. You have given me a family, a home filled with love, a purpose beyond mere survival. You have made me happier than I ever thought possible." "Frank Quincy, you old romantic," Eleanor said, but her voice was thick with emotion. "You gave me all those same things. You took a frightened woman with no family and no prospects and gave her everything she ever dreamed of. You have been my partner, my love, my home for nearly 50 years. I cannot imagine what my life would have been without you." "Lonely," Frank said. "It would have been lonely. I know, because I remember what loneliness felt like before you came. I never want to feel that way again." "You will not," Eleanor promised. "Whatever time we have left, we will have it together." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge, the same stars they had watched together for decades, constant in a changing world. Around them, Their ranch hummed with the quiet sounds of evening cattle settling in the pastures, horses in the barn, the distant laughter of grandchildren playing before bedtime. Frank thought about that young man he had been, lonely and uncertain, reading a letter meant for someone else and making the boldest decision of his life. He thought about Eleanor stepping off that stage, small and frightened but brave, trusting in words on paper and hope in her heart. He thought about all the years between then and now, filled with work and worry, yes, but also with love and laughter and more blessings than he could count. "No regrets?" he asked softly. "Not a single one," Eleanor replied. "You?" "Only that I did not find you sooner," Frank said. "But I suppose the timing was exactly as it needed to be. We found each other when we were ready, when we could appreciate what we had." "Fate," Eleanor said. "Or God's plan, or simple luck. Whatever it was, I am grateful for it." They remained on the porch until the air grew cool and Eleanor shivered slightly. Frank stood, his joints protesting after so long sitting, and helped Eleanor to her feet. They walked inside together, arms around each other, moving through the house they had built together toward the bedroom they had shared for nearly 50 years. Frank lived another 5 years, passing peacefully in his sleep in the spring of 1935 at age 84. Eleanor held his hand as he took his last breath, her heart breaking even as she thanked God for every moment they had shared. She lived on for another 7 years, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, keeping Frank's memory alive through her stories and her love. When Eleanor died in 1942 at age 84, she was buried beside Frank on a hill overlooking the ranch, under a shared headstone that reads simply, "Frank and Eleanor Quincy, beloved parents and grandparents, together always." The ranch remained in the family for generations, each new caretaker adding their own touches while respecting the foundation Frank and Eleanor had built. The story of how they met became family legend, told and retold to each new generation, the tale of a misdelivered letter, a lonely cowboy's courage, and a love that transcended the circumstances of its beginning to become something extraordinary. Their descendants would sometimes visit the graves on that hill, especially on anniversaries and special occasions. They would stand there looking out over the land their ancestors had tamed and cultivated, and they would think about how different all their lives would have been if one letter had gone to the right address instead of the wrong one. They would think about fate and chance, and the courage it takes to reach for happiness even when the path is uncertain. And they would be grateful, as Frank and Eleanor had been grateful every day of their long lives together, that sometimes mistakes turn out to be the greatest blessings of all, and that love can bloom even from the most unlikely beginnings when two hearts are brave enough to remain open to possibility. The house Frank built and later expanded still stood decades later, modified and modernized, but fundamentally the same structure where he had carried Eleanor over the threshold on their wedding night. The barn he had worried was too modest had been renovated multiple times, but never replaced. The garden where Eleanor had spent so many happy hours still bloomed each spring, tended now by granddaughters and great-granddaughters who had inherited her gift for making things grow. In the town of Willits, the church where Frank and Eleanor married still held services every Sunday. The building had been expanded over the years, but the original chapel remained, and several of their descendants were married there, continuing a tradition that stretched back to that Saturday in March 1883, when two people who had never met face-to-face before pledged their lives to each other based on hope and carefully written letters. The general store where Frank had received that fateful misdelivered letter, changed hands many times over the years, was remodeled and modernized, but some of the older residents remembered the story. They would point out the bench where Frank had sat reading a letter meant for someone else, making a decision that would echo through generations. The story of Frank and Eleanor Quincy became more than just family history. It became part of the fabric of Willits itself, a reminder that sometimes the most important moments in life come from unexpected places, that courage and hope can triumph over loneliness and fear, and that true love, when it is found, is worth whatever risks must be taken to embrace it. Their letters to each other, carefully preserved by Eleanor and later by their children, were eventually donated to the County Historical Society. Scholars and romantics alike would read those pages, marveling at the honesty and vulnerability two strangers had shared with each other through ink and paper, building a foundation strong enough to support a lifetime of love. The misdelivered letter itself, the one that started everything, had been kept by Frank in a small wooden box along with other treasures, Eleanor's first embroidered handkerchief to him, the pressed wildflower he had sent her, her first letter in response to his audacious reply. These items remained in the family, passed down as precious heirlooms, tangible evidence of where their story began. James, their eldest son, would tell his grandchildren how their grandfather had been a man of few words in many situations, but had found eloquence when writing to their grandmother. How he had been brave enough to risk rejection and ridicule by responding to a letter meant for another man. How he had built a life through hard work and determination, but had only found true happiness when Eleanor arrived to share it. Rose would tell stories of her mother's strength and grace, how Eleanor had left everything familiar to travel to a strange place to meet a man she had never seen. How she had transformed a rough bachelor's house into a warm home. How she had worked alongside their father as a true partner, never content to simply keep house, but always finding ways to contribute to their shared success. The grandchildren who had known Frank and Eleanor personally carried memories of elderly but still vital people who clearly adored each other. They remembered how their grandfather would light up when their grandmother entered a room, even after decades of marriage. They remembered how their grandmother would touch their grandfather's shoulder in passing, a casual gesture that spoke of deep affection and familiarity. They remembered the way their grandparents would exchange glances that communicated entire conversations without words, the intimacy of two people who had truly become one through years of shared life. The great-grandchildren, who only knew Frank and Eleanor through stories and photographs, nevertheless felt the impact of their legacy. The values Frank and Eleanor had instilled in their children: hard work, integrity, family loyalty, kindness, courage passed down through generations, shaping the character of descendants who never met them. In 1982, exactly 100 years after that letter had been misdelivered, the family organized a reunion at the ranch. Over 200 people attended, all descended from Frank and Eleanor or connected by marriage to those who were. They toured the property, visited the graves, examined the preserved letters and mementos, and shared stories. The oldest attendee was Frank and Eleanor's youngest daughter, Maggie, now 85 years old but still lively and sharp. She had been only 3 when the century turned, but she remembered her parents clearly and spoke of them with deep love and admiration. "My father used to say that the best decision he ever made was answering a letter that was not meant for him," Maggie told the assembled family. "My mother would laugh and say the best decision she ever made was responding to his response. They built this ranch together, yes, but more importantly, they built a family rooted in love and respect. Every one of us here today exists because 2 lonely people were brave enough to reach across distance and uncertainty to find each other. That is a legacy worth celebrating." The reunion included the planting of a tree near Frank and Eleanor's graves, a sturdy oak that would grow for generations, marking the spot where the founders of this dynasty rested. Plaques were placed telling their story in simple words that nevertheless captured the essence of their journey together. As the years continued to pass into decades, and the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the story of Frank and Eleanor Quincy remained alive in family memory and local history. The ranch, though no longer operated by direct descendants, remained a working property, the land they had loved continuing to support livestock and crops. The town of Willits grew and changed with the times, but certain landmarks remained. The church, the historical society with its collection of letters, the cemetery on the hill where generations of Quincy's rested, including at the summit Frank and Eleanor themselves. Occasionally, visitors to the historical society would read the correspondence between Frank and Eleanor, moved by the sincerity and hope expressed in those carefully penned words. Some would be inspired to take chances in their own lives, to be brave enough to pursue connection even when the path was unconventional. The story had a particular resonance for anyone who had ever felt lonely, anyone who had ever taken a risk on love, anyone who had ever wondered if their person was out there somewhere waiting to be found. Frank and Eleanor's story said yes, love is possible even from unlikely beginnings, and yes, it is worth the risk, and yes, sometimes what seems like a mistake is actually destiny working in mysterious ways. In the end, what endured was not just the material legacy of land and property, impressive though that was. What endured was the example Frank and Eleanor had set of what marriage could be: a true partnership built on respect, communication, shared work, and deepening affection. They had shown that love was not just an emotion but a choice, made daily through countless small actions and decisions to put the other first, to work together toward common goals, to remain committed even when times were hard. Their story proved that it was possible to build something lasting from the most uncertain foundations. They had started with nothing but letters and hope, strangers connected by accident, and they had created a love that lasted nearly 50 years and touched hundreds of lives across generations. They had transformed loneliness into belonging, uncertainty into security, and what might have been empty years into a rich, full life overflowing with love, family, and purpose. And it all began with a single misdelivered letter, read by a lonely cowboy on a summer afternoon in 1882, who found the courage to reach for something he wanted even though it was not meant for him, and discovered that sometimes the things we are not supposed to have turned out to be exactly what we need most. Frank Quincy had ridden out seeking a possibility, and he had found his true bride anyway, just as Eleanor Brennan had traveled west hoping for a fresh start, and found instead a love that would define her life and echo through generations of descendants who owed their very existence to that one remarkable moment when chance, courage, and hope converged to create something beautiful and lasting from what should have been nothing more than a postal mistake. Their love story became legend because it spoke to something fundamental in the human heart: the longing for connection, the hope that somewhere out there is someone meant for us, the belief that even when things go wrong, they might actually be going exactly right in ways we cannot yet see. Frank and Eleanor had trusted in that possibility, had been brave enough to act on it, and had been rewarded with a lifetime of love that neither of them ever took for granted, appreciating until their final days the gift they had been given and the life they had built together from a foundation of handwritten words and faith in each other. And so their story ended as all good stories should, with love triumphant, with family surrounding them, with a legacy secure, and with the absolute certainty that whatever else might be true in this uncertain world, Frank and Eleanor Quincy had found exactly what they were looking for in each other, and had lived happily ever after in all the ways that truly mattered.